So this summer we're going to take the entire summer just to look at the parables of Jesus. It won't be exhaustive. So Jesus told quite a few parables. It was one of his favorite go-to styles of teaching. But we're going to engage a number of the parables of Jesus just as a way of kind of stepping back and allowing ourselves to sit as people would sit in his telling of parables to them in the scriptures. You know, a lot of times when those parables are being told, the description is that great crowds gathered, or his disciples have gathered around them, and they're sitting and they're simply listening. And Jesus is teaching them. He's teaching them about the kingdom, about who he is. And so one of the things that we'll do with each of these parables is we're going to ask this question: what does this parable reveal about Jesus himself? Jesus is always, through these parables, revealing something about himself. And by extension, when Jesus is revealing something about himself, he's revealing something about his Father, because he says, "I and my Father are one." So when he reveals something about himself, we can trust that he's revealing faithfully about his Father, and indeed faithfully about the Spirit who comes from the Father and the Son, to make the Father and the Son known. So we're going to weekly ask ourselves, what is Jesus saying about himself in this parable? And then we're going to ask, what is he saying about the kingdom? These are very interrelated questions, but slightly different. What is being revealed about the kingdom? Because most consistently, the parables of Jesus are teaching about the kingdom. How is it that it's going to come? What will it look like? When will its arrival be? How is it going to be a surprise? Over and over again, the parables, and we'll see this as we look at our first parable this morning, the parables are associated with a mystery being revealed. What is it that's being revealed that is on the surface mysterious? So those are some of the questions that we'll ask as we move along here this summer. We begin with the parable of the sower. And in many ways, the parable of the sower is crucial because it's a parable that Jesus tells in many ways to explain why he uses parables. It's a parable that is told that is intended to help us understand not just the content of the other parables, but why he uses them in the first place. So we come to this parable of the sower in Matthew chapter 13. One of the first things that comes out in this parable is this suggestion by Jesus to his disciples. We didn't read this part where the disciples say, "Jesus, we aren't getting this. Explain it to us. Explain this to us." And Jesus, in many ways, the force of his explanation is, do you hear what I say, and do you understand what I mean? So are you hearing my words clearly, and are you understanding what they really mean? The parables are intimately connected here with the ways that the kingdom is revealed to those who have eyes to see, ears to hear, and hearts with which to believe. And hence the substance of the parable of the sower, that is dealing with the most fundamental aspect of hearing parables. Do I have a receptive heart? Am I equipped to hear the words of Jesus and not just understand them intellectually, but understand? Trust, recognize that Jesus is doing something new. Do you hear what I say and understand what I mean? Parables, for those who don't have eyes to see and ears to hear, Jesus says these parables become their own means of judgment. It becomes a blinder. It becomes a way that the kingdom remains mysteriously hidden from those who are so distracted by other things that they can't quite understand and get it, that this is who Jesus is, and this is what he's come to accomplish. And so as we listen to these parables, we want to have this in mind. Are we hearing what Jesus says, and are we understanding what he means? So let's set the stage for the parable of the sower. Setting the stage here for this parable. It says that there's great crowds that are following Jesus. Now, right before this passage, and again, context is always going to be really important. So even though we read one little parable, we're going to, as we set the stage each week for each parable, we're going to make note of the context, because Jesus' teaching doesn't just kind of plop down out of nowhere, but it is a story that's being told in a particular context to a particular people who Jesus has in front of him. And he has in front of him this crowd. Just before this parable, we read about Jesus being in a home and being very crowded in. And we read that his mother and brothers are at the door asking him to come home, because they are embarrassing the family. He's embarrassing the family. And so they say, hey, your mother and brother are here for you. It doesn't say it, I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially they have come to say, okay, maybe you've taken this a little too far, Jesus. People are saying bad things about you. It's reflecting badly on the family. You're going to get yourself hurt because there are people who are really angry with you. And it's reported to Jesus in this crowded room, your mother and brother are at the doors for you. And what does Jesus say? He says, my mother and my brothers? My mother and my brothers are those who do the will of my Father in heaven. See, the stage is being kind of set for our hearing now of this parable that comes right after this. In fact, in Matthew's gospel it says, on that same day, Jesus is beside the lake, and this crowd is with him, who have been following and listening to his teaching. And so he gets in a boat in order to speak to this large crowd who have probably gathered someplace on the northwest bank of the Sea of Galilee. This takes place up in Galilee. From a boat where his voice can deflect off the water up into the crowd, it forms a natural little amphitheater so that he can teach this large crowd effectively. And so it says that he begins to teach them in parables, and he teaches them using these images that are probably fresh in their mind. Maybe as the crowds have gathered in the city, knowing that, oh, this Jesus of Nazareth is there. Let's go check him out. We've heard that he does these miraculous healings, and he's teaching people, and there's some tension between him and the Pharisees, and sometimes we don't like the Pharisees because they make our lives really difficult, because they say you have to do this, and you have to do this, and you have to do this. Let's hear what this Jesus has to say, who's kind of raising a little bit of a fuss. I'm curious. That's what the crowds are there for. They're curious, and they want to know, what's this Jesus about? And on their way there, they quite possibly could have passed a farmer scattering his seed. They didn't have combines. They didn't plow nice, neat rows. They would go into their field. A farmer would go into his field with his bag of seed, and he would scatter. And in that field, there would be good soil, lots of good soil, and then there would be places that would be rockier patches where the limestone is poking up through the ground. And the paths that would be followed through the field or around the field. And his seed would go in all places. Some would fall on the path. And the farmer wasn't concerned about that. A little bit gets on the path, that's okay. The birds come along and eat it. No problem. Some gets into those rocky places. That's fine. Some falls in places where there are some thorns germinating from the season before. That's fine. They're going to grow up. They'll choke out the seed, but that will just be a small number. I've I've torn a lot of thorn and thistle out of my field over the course of the past year, so I can trust that most of this seed is going to fall in a good place, is going to produce a healthy crop. A healthy crop would be tenfold, a tenfold crop. And so, quite possibly, this image is fresh in the minds of those who have gathered on the bank to listen to Jesus tell a story about a farmer who goes out to sow. And he sows seed. And he sows seed, and it falls in various places in the field. Nothing strange or unfamiliar. Not rocket science. And not this either. This is not a children's illustration. Jesus does not hear this clearly from the start. As we start the summer, Jesus does not tell parables so that people have a nice, neat children's illustration to get through their thick heads. That's not why Jesus does not. Parables are theology. Jesus is doing adult-level theology when he tells parables. And the evidence is what? The evidence is the fact that some people don't get it. So either Jesus is really bad at telling nice, pithy illustrations to help the dim-witted understand the kingdom. Either he's really bad at that because a lot of people don't get it, or that's not his point in the first place. And it's the latter. It's not his point in the first place to tell this nice, neat little illustration so that dim-witted people like you and I can get it. No, he's doing theology. And he's doing so in a subversive way. The parables are subversive. They're supposed to surprise you. They're supposed to get under your skin. They're supposed to catch you off guard. So when the crowds are listening to this story about a sower going out to sow, scattering his seed, they think they know where Jesus is. Oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I've seen it before. et cetera, et cetera. I know what the different soils are. But there's more to it than what lays on the surface. Seed in the prophetic tradition, and Jesus, all through his ministry to this point, is portrayed as the prophet, the one who has come to fulfill the prophets, the one who is greater than Moses, the great prophet of the Lord, the one who is greater than Elijah, the one who is greater than Solomon in terms of his wisdom. That is precisely how Jesus is portrayed. So don't think that Jesus is dumbing it down in the parable of the sower. No, he's working some Old Testament themes in very clever ways and in ways that will surprise. So when he's talking about seed, he's not just talking about seed that gets scattered. In the Old Testament, seed is often a reference to the remnant. When Israel goes into exile in judgment because they have failed to keep covenant with the Lord, they're sent off into exile, and the people think, the Lord has utterly rejected us. We are forever cut off because of our unfaithfulness. And through the Old Testament prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, and to a lesser extent the minor prophets, over and over again the Lord says, no, don't worry, I am not rejecting you forever because of my part, not because you're somehow going to get your act together, but because of my grace and my mercy, I have reserved for myself a remnant, a seed that will one day flourish. So when Jesus is talking about seed, he's talking about more than just seed. He's talking about remnant. He's talking about who he is and what he's doing. That seed will one day grow, and the growth of the remnant, the return of the remnant, the regathering of the people is something that will happen when the Messiah comes. So Jesus here in this seemingly pithy little story about a farmer casting seed is saying something about the timing of things, that the time has come. And we know this to be true because Because before this parable, we've heard over and over again Jesus' announcement that the kingdom has come, that the time is at hand. This is who I am. And so this parable becomes just another way of Jesus saying that now is the time. Now is the time. And indeed, because I am coming and announcing that the kingdom is coming in a way that is not to be expected, don't think that the word of the kingdom, so seed being sown, oftentimes the word of God in the Old Testament is referred to as being sown into people's hearts so that it would bear fruit. Those metaphors are common among the rabbis and in the old covenant era. And so when Jesus is talking about the sowing of seed and a word going out and a word being received that bears fruit, there's more to it than simply, did this farmer get it right planting his crop, or did he luck out having a 30 or 60 or 100-fold return? No, Jesus is talking about the kingdom, and he's talking about his Father. And so the stage is set. What does Jesus reveal about himself? Precisely this, that with his coming is the ingathering of the seed. He chooses 12 disciples because he is saying that now is Israel's time to be regathered from their being scattered and exiled. And these 12 disciples are effectively the new Israel being gathered together. That I am gathering together this remnant seed, and that indeed it will bear fruit. It will bear fruit. Jesus reveals about himself that the word is going to go out not in the ways that typically would be expected. No longer is the focus going to be the Pharisaic tradition, the Mosaic law. It's not over and over again. Jesus is saying to his disciples and any who would hear that it matters not whether you adhere as carefully as you can to the Mosaic law, because it cannot save you. Over and over again, that's Jesus' emphasis. This sowing of the seed is a sowing that is done by Jesus' word going forth, the word of the prophet, the great prophet who has come, the one greater than Moses, and his word goes out in order to gather the remnant back to himself. Jesus reveals the kingdom. What is it about the kingdom that's being revealed? Well, one thing that comes through emphatically is the generosity of God. Again, the farmer sows generously, knowing that not all is going to fall in places where it will bear fruit. The sower knows this. The Lord knows this. The Lord knows that when we share our testimony, when we share our lives with others, that it will not always result in somebody saying, oh yeah, that sounds great, sign me up, I want to follow Jesus. It will not always result in people saying, oh yeah, now I get why Jesus had to die on the cross. That makes perfect sense to me. No, there will still be people, plenty of people, who will be offended by the cross, who will think that the gospel we proclaim, and note that that's how Matthew in this parable puts it, that the message of the gospel is the phrase he uses. Mark uses word. Matthew uses the message of the gospel in his explanation to his disciples. The message of the gospel is sometimes going to fall, is going to hit hearts that are like a rocky path. And we ought not be surprised by it. And sometimes it's gonna fall on ground that is shallow, and we're going to see a little sprout come up that will mimic life, and then it's going to fall away when time gets tough, because the message of the kingdom is that you have to be in it for the long haul. This This is a message that is inviting people to do what? Take up your cross daily and follow me. That's what the message of the gospel is about. That's why Jesus, he knows that he's got to be subversive, because if he just comes straight on, you know what kind of a response he got when he said, you have to take up your cross daily and follow me. Who wants to do that? But Jesus subversively invites his disciples to join with him in this message of good news that is grounded in self-sacrificial love. Even though the world will not get it. Sometimes the thorns and thistles are simply going to choke it. And maybe in the West we see that more than in any other place in the world with regard to Christianity. That in the West, the message of the gospel gets choked by stuff, simply by the cares of this world, by having too much stuff, being too content with the ease of our lives, being too wrapped up in the false messages, the false gospels that are proclaimed. If you have this, if you drive this kind of car, if you have this kind of home, if you yada, yada, yada. That's what's going to save you. That's what's going to make you happy. And it chokes the message of the gospel. Chokes the life right out of it. Jesus knows this. And so he preaches to Pharisees, and he preaches to Sadducees, and he preaches to people who the crowds think are unworthy. The Pharisees and the Sadducees. Why are you preaching to the tax collector? Why are you preaching to the prostitute? Should not the message of the gospel be reserved for the righteous, for the people who already have their lives together? That's the criticism that Jesus is facing. And Jesus says the sower sows generously. And it goes out, and sometimes you don't know, you and I don't know. He's saying to the crowd, you don't know what kind of soil lays down inside these people. You didn't know that in Matthew's heart, Levi, the tax collector, you didn't realize that he had good soil in there. And the Spirit was going to work in there and produce a heart of flesh, so that in this traitorous, despicable tax collector, we would find one who would one day write the gospel, one of the gospels, telling precisely about my gracious kingdom. You didn't realize that this prostitute, indeed, by the power of the Spirit, is given a heart of flesh, is given good soil in which this message of the gospel may be planted, and she becomes one who provides the first testimony to my resurrection. Wow. The generosity of the sower works out pretty well. That generosity, the sowing generously of the gospel, we benefit from. You see, we are recipients. We're benefactors of the fact that the Lord sows generously. And if we think, oh no, it's not because the Lord has sown generously, then we have to start to question, what condition is my heart? If I'm not ready to simply accept that this is, that my knowing Jesus is part of this generous sowing on behalf of the sower, then I ought to be questioning my own heart's condition. Jesus reveals the kingdom as a kingdom that sows generously. And leaves us with this question: do you have ears to hear? Do you have ears to hear? We all have ears. You're my two ears. You know how little kids are. Sometimes little kids, kind of like husbands sometimes. Husbands are like this sometimes. Did you hear me? You know, Avery, our 2.5-year-old grandson, now he's getting to that point where he is becoming adept at hearing but not hearing, right? I'm realizing that if I act like I didn't hear you, I can push my limits. That's an important thing for a young child, right? To learn how to take responsibility for his or her life, to learn independence. But it also, in their own little sinful inclination, includes this very stubborn, rebellious, when we're coming up to the street and he wants to run ahead and you say, Avery, stop. And it's a little scary when you realize that he hears you, but he doesn't hear you. Do we have ears to hear and hearts to receive? Many are the barriers to receiving the gift. Many are the barriers that stand in the way of our receiving. And many are the barriers that stand in the way of others receiving. Our prayer ought to be, you see, we participate in this ongoing, generous sowing of the message of the gospel. Jesus isn't the, by extension, because we are the body of Christ, we join with him in sowing the message of the gospel in our own ways. That's why we keep saying, learn to tell your story. And work into it some of the stories of Jesus. That's going to be really helpful. But learn to tell your story, because that's part of sowing the gospel of the kingdom and inviting people to hear. And we're called to sow generously. We aren't called to decide, oh, this person, I don't think they're going to get it. Oh, this person, this is a nice person. This is a good person. You know, they never curse. They're fine, upstanding citizens. They're worthy recipients of the sowing of this seed. Now, Jesus invites us to sow generously, because what does he promise? In the end, this is the promise of the parable. This is what Jesus is saying. I've come to regather the remnant. And he's saying to his initial hearers, to the people who are there in front of him, including his disciples, who, after his resurrection and ascension, will look around at who's left of those big crowds, and it's going to be a small group of people, and they're going to say, really? Is this the remnant? Is this what he promised? And then they remember back to that parable of the sower. And they remember that the Lord's promise is more than a regular harvest, 100-fold, 60-fold, 30-fold. Indeed, the Lord is the Lord who causes growth. And so we sow generously, as the disciples, the earliest disciples, sowed generously. Sometimes they had to be prodded to head out into Gentile land to sow more generously. But they sowed generously, and look what the Lord did. Look what the Lord did. Look at who his people, look at what has happened to this initial scattering of seed on Jesus' part, gathering in the remnant. Now the people of God stretch across this globe, speak thousands of languages, sing songs using whole variety of instruments, dress in all kinds of different ways, eat all kinds of different food, but they proclaim one Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. They lay claim to one hope in the death of Jesus at the cross, his resurrection and ascension. They are made alive all across this globe, brothers and sisters of ours. The fruit being born of this gospel message, being scattered generously, is being raised up all across this globe to the glory of the Father in heaven, to the glory of Father, Son, and Spirit. So let's simply take our part. Having ears to hear and hearts with which to believe. Let's simply take our part, to do our part in scattering the seed generously, patiently, consistently, trusting that the Lord's promise, the promise that Jesus makes in this parable, is a promise that has already proven to be true. and will continue to do so. Let's pray.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. So